Hi, good evening, good morning, all of you. We will start in 3 minutes, okay? So to those of you who joined us now, we will wait 2 more minutes and we will start. Okay, so I think we can start now. As we said, 3 minutes past 5. So good afternoon here in Israel and good morning to our friends in America. My name is Alon and I'm the Director General of SEED Israel. And this is our great honor holding this webinar today in order to share with you the finding of a large-scale survey aimed to assess how the COVID-19 pandemic affected the civil society organizations in low and mid-income countries, and discuss how Israel and the world jury can join the global efforts in fighting the COVID-19. We are privileged to have with us today some very interesting speakers who are contributing to achieve meaningful change in the international development field in general and in the Israeli and the world Jewry involvement in this field in particular. I want to thank Mr. Yitzhak Herzog, the chairman of the Jewish Agency, one of only few Israeli leaders who understand the importance and the potential of international development, that in his current role established practical tools that will bring Israeli and the world Jewry to build common agenda on the basis of international development. I want to thank our friend Ariel Tubi, the Director General of the President Office, who during the time he served placed international development on the President agenda and hosted meetings and conferences that facilitated a cross-sectoral dialogue between the Israeli ecosystem in the field of development, as well as joint discourse with the world Jewry, which highlight was the President's visit to Ethiopia, in which for the first time, the President of Israel invited the world Jewry to cooperate with Israel for the empowerment of Africa. I also want to thank Mr. Eitan Stiva, the first Israeli to realize the great potential in impact investment in Africa, for his continuous philanthropic assistance of large number of programs and institutions that promote cooperation between Africa and Israel. Of course, to thank also Ms. Lidi Hakizmina from Rwanda, who is a social entrepreneur, who will continue to share with us her experience in the field, and to our friend, Mr. Larry Cooley, the president of Seed International, who has a wide experience in the developing world. Before I will invite Dr. Bruria Adini, the head of the Emergency Management and Disaster Medicine Department at the Tel Aviv University, to share with us the main finding of the survey, I want to thank Yuval Eckstein and our partners at the Shalom Corps for working with us on this survey, and Orit Strauss from Giving Way, an amazing Israeli company that made a revolution in the field of volunteering in the developing world. And of course, special thanks, like always, to the Pierce Foundation that has been supporting us for years now and allow us to accomplish our goals. The discussion today will be led by Ariel Glumi, the chairman of Seed Israel. And at this stage, I want to invite Dr. Adini to present the main finding of the survey. Bruria, please.
Thank you very much, Alon, and thank you for the opportunity both to be with all of you distinguished guests today, as Alon said, this morning or this evening, depending on where each one is, and also to be part of this very challenging and exciting survey, which was, as Alon had said, actually a collaboration between several of the organizations. It was led by Seed Israel in collaboration with Giving Way, with Shalom Corps, with the Tel Aviv University. And with your permission, I will open the presentations, which will help us all to look at the main results. Can everyone see? Sorry, I need to share the screen. And please tell me if you see the presentation. Is it visible? Yes? Good. Okay. So I want to start at first with why we actually launched this survey. Alon said that what we wanted to see was the impact of the COVID-19 crisis, which was a global crisis, on the different organizations, the civil societies organizations and non-governmental organizations that operate in low and low-income countries. But what is important to state that we didn't just want to see what the picture is. The real reason for launching this survey is actually to try to understand what are the main gaps and obstacles that prevent the different civil societies organizations from helping both continuing their operations for what they were even before the COVID era were doing in the different low and low mid-income countries, but also try to understand how they can be of great help to the different countries during the survey, during the COVID-19, sorry, and most especially what we can do, all of the organizations and the responding bodies in the different countries together in order to actually make it more effective, to bounce forward, to make it something that we can all do together much more effectively. So when we launched the survey, there were two main objectives. The first was to actually understand and identify the impact of the crisis on the functional operability of the different organizations, especially to identify the specific needs that were derived from the crisis and the gaps that prevent the different organizations from helping in the most effective way the different countries in which they operate. So just to give you first some overview of where the different organizations operated. We're talking about 441 different organizations, different NGOs and CSOs that responded to the survey. The survey was actually disseminated both in English, in French, and in Spanish to allow everyone to understand in the native language. And this actually facilitated getting a response from a large cohort of organizations. 60% of the organizations which responded were small organizations. They had less than 10 employees. And even when we looked at the number of volunteers that they actually deployed in order to try to achieve their goals, we're talking about small organizations. 20% of them were much larger organizations deploying from 21 and up. There are some that had actually hundreds of employees. The main fields of operations before the COVID-19 crisis, you can see here, the largest number of the organizations were involved in different activities of education, health, food or psychosocial support, but there are also organizations that focus more on technology or on shelters. We can see a large array of different types of areas in which they operate in the countries. When we look to see the different locations where they operate, and we have to take into account that some of the organizations operate in more than one country, but we see that the largest continent, if we can focus according to the continents and not only countries, so 85% actually are working in African countries. Approximately 10% work in Asian countries. And specifically within the continent, we saw 95 organizations stated that they work in Uganda, 66 work in Kenya, 48 in South Africa, and approximately 44, 43 were working in Ghana and Tanzania. So we can see that there are specific countries in which we have a much larger number of organizations. The first question we asked them then, what were you able to do and what did you facilitate in those locations, specifically targets to assist the countries in managing the COVID-19? And what we can see, according to the different organizations, the major part of the organization were involved partly or fully in education activities. About 50% of them were also active concerning risk communication, which means relaying different types of information to the populations so that they can cope and understand according to different behaviors and different types of assistance that they can have during the COVID-19. But we also had some organizations that help providing medical services and psychosocial support, which we know in such a crisis is something which is very, very important to the local populations. We then wanted to see and hear from them what measures they, as organizations, had to actually implement, first of all, to enable their functional continuity and also to protect their own workers, the employees, the volunteers, and even the people that they came in contact with as part of their assistance. So we see that the major elements, and this is on a scale from 0, not at all, to 6 to a very large extent, what they had to do in the largest extent is, first of all, be very flexible concerning the working conditions. Many of them could not work from the regular infrastructure which they had before the crisis. They needed to increase substantially the communication with the personnel as well as with the volunteers. Maintaining social distances, which is something which sometimes can be a challenge in many of these countries. We also see the coordination both between the organizations and the different authorities, the ministries and so on, but also collaborations among the different NGOs that actually work in the area. What we can see that just to a very small extent, at least relevant to the other steps that I've mentioned, is arrange transportation, for example, for their employee, which is a challenge during such a crisis, because we know that public transportations may be greatly impacted as a result of the different measures. We then wanted to understand how the national regulation and directives, which were actually instructed by the local authorities and the national authorities in the countries in which the different organizations operate, how, according to the perceptions of the representatives of the NGOs and the civil society organizations, how did they perceive the impact on their own ability to operate and to continue their functional operability? So we see that restricted mobility, which most countries actually initiated, impacted highly or very highly on 85% of the organizations. The same with the social distancing. The fact that we need to maintain social distance actually impacts on our ability as an organization to provide or continue to provide the services, as did to slightly a lower extent, but still very, very relevant. Almost 74% were impacted by the lockdown that were issued in some of the countries in which they operate, including home quarantine of themselves, their employees, or actually the beneficiaries. We then wanted to, again, see, according to what the organizations themselves said, what was the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on their level of operability. And we can see that over 70% of the organizations, of the 441 organizations, said that they were impacted to a very large or a large extent by the different consequences of the COVID-19. Specifically, when they listed what impacted and what were the consequences, we can see that the three highest means of impact had to do with resources and funding. Decreased fundings, decreased donations, limited access to the resources which they need in order to be operable. They also listed other elements such as staff expressing concerns to work, but we see that when we asked if they had a problem, that over 50% of the members and the employees did not report to work. We see this as a lower level, considering comparison to the decreased fundings or the resources. And now we come to what I feel is the main element and the main subject which we actually have to look at, and that is the main obstacles as perceived by the representatives of the different organizations that prevented them from being able to assist or be active in assisting in COVID-19 management. So you remember what I said the consequences were before, and we saw the elements concerning funding and so on. But when the question was directed, what were the main obstacles? We had a surprising response. The highest or the most impacting elements, first was access to information. We need to understand what is going on, what we can and cannot do. The regulations of the authorities, nobody actually discussed it with them and actually communicated to see how the regulations can be made specifically to organizations in such a way that they could assist the local authorities or the national authorities. Understanding and addressing the changing needs of the populations. The needs change according, first of all, to the crisis itself, and of course, in accordance to the regulations or the instructions that are directed by the authorities of that country. So these are the three main elements that were actually highlighted by the largest amount of the organizations, and this is something that we need to look at. If we look at the funding that we saw before, that certainly there was a consequence, we see that this here, the average was 3.13, very far from the 4.21 or 4.19 when we're talking about access of information or regulations of the authorities. So this is something important for us to note, because these are elements that actually can be worked on, assisted, in order to facilitate the work of the different organizations. So I told you before that what we wanted to do is not just understand and look at the picture, but also try to see how we can take those insights in order to facilitate and help the NGOs and the different organizations to work more effectively. And so there are four main insights that we can actually utilize in order to bounce forward. First of all, we need to facilitate the distribution, the disseminations of vital information of what are their needs, what is the type of assistance that can be made, and we need to be actually very active in expanding the awareness of the different government systems and the different authorities to the needs of the NGOs or the civil society, so that these organizations can then help those national authorities or local authorities to supply and provide basic needs and vital needs much more effectively. We need to enhance the collaboration, both between the stakeholders themselves and between the stakeholders and the different authorities, so that we can actually maximize the capacities, and we cannot escape or not look at the funding. So we also should do as much as possible to actually expand and magnify the available resources that can assist the different organizations to operate even more extensively than they did in the pre-COVID-19 crisis. So these are the main results. I only want to complete this by expressing, I think, the appreciation of all of us that were involved in the study, to all those organizations that are facilitating, that are working there, that have not just gone into the lockdown, but actually looked for ways to assist the local governance systems in order to provide more and more help to the different populations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adina, and thank you very much, Mr. Alon Ber, for your opening remarks. My name is Ariel Gloomy. I'm the chairman of Seed Israel. It's very nice to see everybody online today. We have asked two people to give their opening remarks and greetings to all of us. Our first speaker today will be Mr. Yitzhak Herzog, chairman of the Jewish Agency for Israel. In the past 15 years, Mr. Herzog has held several ministerial positions: Minister of Housing and Construction, Minister of Tourism, Minister of Diaspora, and Minister of Welfare and Social Services. If that sounds a lot to you, let me tell you that since then we have many more government ministries in Israel. Mr. Herzog, the floor, or actually the mic, is yours, please.
So thank you very much, Mr. Gloomy, and thank you very much as well, Alon, for the excellent work that Seed Israel is doing. I want to thank my good friends from the Pears Foundation, which has been doing so much work in this field, and welcome two good friends of mine, Eitan Stiva, and of course, Arel Tubi, who will follow suit after my brief introduction. You know, we are looking at this situation from somewhat of a different angle, because the Jewish Agency is the biggest Jewish organization in the world, and we are dealing mostly with the plight of Jews from all over the world. And in the COVID-19 crisis, we've watched and seen some very devastating consequences of communities all over the world, which we are helping and aiding through various means, as well as challenges within Israeli society through our mission as a very impactful organization within Israel. But one of our main goals in general is Tikkun Olam, is healing the world. And for that matter, we are very proud of two major initiatives that operate in medium income countries and low income countries. Especially the older one is Project 10, which is projects all over the world. Mostly we have a few in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, etc. That together with the community, we bring volunteers from Israel and the World Jewry to work within the communities themselves. And in the last year and a half, we've launched Shalom Corps, which was mentioned here as a partner in some of this research. And this organization is actually aiming to work as a Jewish Peace Corps in communities in third world countries and other countries all over the world, and inner cities as well. So in this realm, we are actually studying the field, and we're about to launch major activity of Shalom Corps. And we are interested in cooperating further, and we'll be happy to do that with SID through Shalom Corps and the other projects that we have. And we will be happy to review the situation, see what can be done and where we're at. I would point out, of course, that some of the problems that we're faced with is, of course, questions about priorities, because naturally we're dependent on income and sources from mostly Jewish institutions and foundations and federations, and they're looking into the social challenges of their own communities, and they are quite big because it's an issue that has affected the world dramatically. And I am worried. I do not know where the international organizations are when it comes to going deep into the communities in these medium and low income countries, because when it comes to philanthropy, I think partially it may be challenged. Anyhow, we will be happy to sit down with SID Israel and look further into the situation through our relevant agencies. And I want to wish all of you good luck and thank you for supporting and being involved in this extremely important cause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Herzog. We have definitely seen over the past several years a growing involvement of the Jewish Agency in the field of international development and humanitarian aid, and that's very, very important for us. Our second speaker will be Mr. Hariel Tubi, the Director General of the Office of the President of the State of Israel. Unfortunately, due to a family constraint, Mr. Tubi could not join us, but he has managed to record a short video, a greeting in a video. So I will ask now my colleague Maria to please play the video.
Israel and the world, Israeli and Jewish organizations, philanthropists, academics, Israeli officials, all members of the Israeli and Jewish developing community, and of course, the great people of SID organization. It is my pleasure to speak to you on this event today. You are here to lay down the foundations for a better future in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. The coronavirus pandemic is a universal crisis. It harms both Jews and non-Jews, both developed countries and developing countries. As in every crisis, the poorest countries suffer the most serious harms. The ventures and collaborations that promote aid to the developing world are not strange to us here in Beit Hanassi, the office of the President of Israel. Just 2 years ago, in May 2018, the office of the President headed groundbreaking, unprecedented delegation to Ethiopia, organized together with SID Israel and the Olam organization. And this February, last February, only 3 months ago, the President led a summit meeting in Fiji with the Pacific Island states, which focused, among other issues, on the abilities of Israel to assist Pacific Island nations with natural disaster, with health and security, and in advanced agriculture and water management. Our journeys to Ethiopia and Fiji were initiated after we realized two very important facts. The first was that developing world is a growing economic power with great potential. And the second was that the state of Israel itself is maybe the biggest success story of a developing country. In those journeys, our most central partners were philanthropic foundations, NGOs and CSOs from the Jewish world. We understood that the cooperation between Israel and the global Jewish community is creating partnerships in the developing world, can be unique force for good that helps these developing nations and creates a better future. The key organization that connects Israel and the world Jewry is the Jewish Agency for Israel, successfully led by our dear friend, Mr. Yitzhak Herzog, which Beit HaNassi is proud to cooperate with on many occasions. In the wake of this coronavirus crisis, there are many actors and institutions, both Jews and non-Jews, who want to help. A key component which is necessary to generate effective help and aid is a solid base of research-based knowledge, providing both direction and orientation to bodies, to institutions, to governments, which with a good motivation to act in this field. This is, I believe, the deep importance of this research initiative, a joint project of the SEED organization, Tel Aviv University, and of course the Peace Corps. So thank you very much for conducting this essential enterprise and for hosting this important event. It's important. It's an important step in the direction for a better world, and of course for a better future. So thank you and good luck.
I would like to thank Mr. Tubi for his warm words. Before we segue to the next stage of our webinar today, I would like to ask those who still have not switched their mics into mute mode, please do it right now. Today we have three exceptional speakers. Each has a long experience in his or her field, and also each one of them wears several hats. So with your permission and for the benefit of time, I will only mention a tiny part of your bios. We have with us today Larry Cooley, Mr. Eitan Stiba, and Mrs. Lidi Hakizama. Our first speaker today will be Mr. Eitan Stiba. Mr. Stiba is the founding partner and investment committee member of the Vital Capital, a leading impact investment private equity fund focused on sub-Saharan Africa. Mr. Stiba is an entrepreneur who has been actively invested in building businesses in Africa for the past 30 years. Mr. Stiba, you have many years of business experience in Africa, but you have also supported civil society organization in the continent. In your opinion, what can we do in order to secure the financial stability of civil society organization so that they can operate effectively in times of crisis? In addition to that, I would also like to ask another question. Many people worry about the economic consequences of COVID-19 to developing economies. Some estimate that 40 to 60 million people will be pushed to extreme poverty as a result of the crisis. And also there are estimations the global economy will shrink by 3 to 3.2%. So what could be the role of impact investing that you have been involved with for many years in strengthening civil society organization to prepare and respond to the crisis? Mr. Silva, please go ahead. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the speakers before me. So impact investors and civil society organizations, NGOs, have social and environment missions which are very similar. So there's a lot to learn from each other. About Africa, it's interesting, I read the WHO report, and you see that the pandemic hit the African economy much before health issues appeared. Commodity prices dropped, currency devaluation, border closure, international trade restriction, all that happened much before the first COVID-19 cases appeared. So they had time to prepare. In brackets, I'll say that Africa is a young continent. Over 60% of the population are below 25 years old. So that's a great advantage for them. And until now, there were only about 100,000 cases found in over a billion people continent. So I'll be practical because we're practical in the field, and I'll try to address a few issues. First thing that we implemented was to protect the people working in our organization. So it's a bit similar like the emergency procedure in an airplane crisis, where first they recommend first put the oxygen mask on yourself and then treat your kids or the others. Same thing. First inform your employees in order that they can go on and do their work. More than that, the more they are informed and knowledgeable about the situation, they will go home, teach their families, teach their communities how to behave, and obviously save many lives in that way. Another very important thing to share with the people in the organizations is how to deal with the decision-making or the difficult decision-making in a period of uncertainty. It's not easy. I think Africans in general are more experienced in that. They experience more crisis during lifetime than the Europeans. So they have some experience. But again, it's a great tool for life in general to learn how to deal with taking decisions in uncertain times. About the financial issue of NGOs, so first, the first thing we did was look inside, make sure that every dollar invested generates as much impact as possible. And I'm sure there are many ways to, it's a good time to look inside and find a way to cut costs. In addition, call for assistance from the local population, from the communities. You don't need everything to be paid for. In such situations, the community will join the efforts, and you will have very good local resources to support you. For example, in Uganda, we have a dairy. There were huge logistic issues once the pandemic hit, and we asked the farmers to support in logistics and transportation, and they just understood the situation and helped. So second thing is share resources and knowledge between the different organizations, because there's a lot to share. And each organization should be flexible to open up and learn from the others, help the others, and use the manpower in each to help the other people involved in the same communities. Flexibility meaning looking at the changing needs. Okay, you came there to deal with water, sanitation, and so forth, but now it's different. We have to look at other issues. So we have to respond fast and change the focus and go ahead and deliver other solutions for that community. So I would say that impact investing is designed to sustain during times of crisis. It creates resilience. And how does it do that? First of all, we adopt measuring tools. I think NGOs and social entities, anyone involved in social benefit for the population should adopt measuring tools, measuring not only of the social impact, short term, how many treatments and how many food rations were delivered, but also the outcome, long-term outcome, to collect the feedback to see how the general education improves in a region when you improve sanitation, for example. We recruit talent. We believe that the good people will do better long-term over short-term volunteers. We think that's a big advantage. We partner with local people. So for us as investors, it's part of the exit strategy. But I think it is also enables the locals to take over the organization for the long run. And about flexibility, I mentioned already that it's important to be open and flexible to adjust to the changing needs. Thank you very much. I have more things to say, but there are more speakers to join us.
Thank you very much, Eitan, for your insights. I want to remind everybody that we have an open chat. So if you want to add questions that we can later on address, please write them through the chat, and my colleague Maria will collect the questions. Our next speaker today is Mr. Lidi Hakizimana. Lidi is a leading social entrepreneur from Rwanda. In 2006, she co-founded Drakkar Ltd, the first social business in Rwanda and one of the biggest local publishers in the country. In 2015, she started a chain of preschools called Happy Hearts. Currently, she's the interim CEO of the African Institute for Mathematical Science. And on top of it, she is a good friend of mine. Lidi holds a master's degree in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School. Lidi, could you please share with us the effects of COVID-19 outbreak on civil society organization in Rwanda? Do the challenges described in the survey presented by Dr. Adini reflect the reality in Rwanda? And how did you personally react as an NGO leader in your own organization? Lidi, the floor is yours. Lidi, can you hear us?
Yes.
Great.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, but we see you in a quite strange way.
It's really bizarre. My computer is funny. Anyway, so just to give you a little bit of background information about what has been happening in Rwanda, the first COVID-19 case that we had in Rwanda was in March 12. The government at that time decided to close the borders and to go into complete lockdown. This decision, even if it was really abrupt, really helped us to contain the virus in the country. So far, we have about 350 cases and 1 death. And the government in general is very decentralized. So the ministers, when the first cases started, decided to contribute their monthly salary, their April salary, so that
inviting me, and thanks everybody for listening in. And thanks in particular to all of you who worked on this very interesting survey. I'm going to wear a couple of hats as I give a few comments. The first is as president of SID International, which, as some of you may know, has been around for 63 years and has chapters in 16 countries, including the very active one in Israel that Ariel and Alon are responsible for directing. But I also serve as a curator of the community of practice on scaling development outcomes. And that community of practice, with some thousands of members, recently did a survey of its members around responses to COVID and what's going on, particularly in their field-based operations. And as Ariel mentioned, I ran for 35 years one of the larger US for-profit consulting firms that works on developing programs in the third world called Management Systems International. And we did a lot of work in particular on the issue of resilience in fragile states. So I'm going to try to weave together a few of those issues in the few minutes I have. The first I would say is that if you want to think about this COVID response, there's a temptation to go back to things like the Ebola or the HIV crisis, or maybe natural disaster or recovery from war. I want to suggest to you those are not the best models to use for thinking about this, because those are typically a shock followed by a somewhat predictable recovery. This is a series of things. It starts as a public health crisis, but it then becomes an everything crisis, and it tends to exaggerate in somewhat unpredictable ways the cleavages and the problems that already existed in the society, as well as creating some new ones. It also, somewhat ironically, creates several opportunities. I'm going to try to hit on a few of the high points of both in the context of the survey and the issue. But overall, I think we have to think of this, those of us who work on development, as a real inflection point. I think someday we'll talk about the world before coronavirus and the world after coronavirus as if this were a real dividing point in our approach to many things. So let me say a little bit about the model that I think works better than epidemics or recovery from financial crises or post-war reconstruction. I think for those of us in the development field, the best mental model we have for this is resilience programming. Why? Because when we talk about resilience, we're talking about the interplay between humanitarian and developmental issues. We're talking about the short-run urgencies balanced against or related to the longer-term needs. We're talking about the need for very local solutions to very national problems, and we're talking about huge uncertainties. And what we've learned about managing in situations of resilience is that there are two principal gaps. The first one has to do with coordination. Why? In part because the problems are so complicated, but in part because there's such a large and heterogeneous array of players that are trying to respond, and very few fora or intermediaries that can bring those players together. I've been working, for example, for the last several years on resilience in South Sudan, a very extreme case, I'll grant you, but one that really makes the point about how many players are need to coordinate their efforts in order to have an effective response either at a local or at a national level. Think about this in the context of NGOs and COVID. I'll give you just, again, a couple of parameters that make this, I think, obvious. In South Africa, there are 200,000 registered NGOs. If you counted the CSOs, you'd be somewhere over 1 million. If NGOs around the world were a country, they'd be the 5th largest economy in the world. So think about the problem of trying to coordinate organizations like that. In the survey that you all did, 60% of those surveyed had less than 10 employees. So you have the sheer problem of numbers, and how do you coordinate or share information among that many players? Compounding that, we're in the middle of an era which has had really closing space for civil society, and that gets worse in crisis, not better, as countries tend to indulge their authoritarian impulses. One of the roles that's is to try to keep its convening authority as a way to bring together entities, particularly from civil society, that might otherwise be squeezed out of this kind of conversation. But even we don't have a good way to involve the smaller, truly more local CSOs that are involved. So let me turn specifically for information sharing to the UN clusters. I've had a personal role in organizing a number of those, and what I can tell you is the representation and the involvement of CSOs is a perennial problem, even for the best intentioned clusters. So they tend to invite in what you might call the darlings, the ones that everyone knows. That favors INGOs over NGOs, it favors NGOs over CSOs, it favors the larger over the smaller. And that creates huge power and information asymmetries in this. It also, those fora tend to work much better for well-established problems than for novel problems. That's on the negative side. Let me turn very briefly to the positive side. And that is that this particular set of problems has forced people, whether they liked it or not, to try to deal in more dynamic, more flexible, more adaptive ways to the problems at hand. You simply can't manage them in command and control ways. And that's bringing about, in some places, some really overdue breakthroughs in the way these decisions get made and information gets shared. We're starting to see much more use of radio and SMS. We're seeing places where geography isn't a limiting factor, where people don't have to come to the capital or be based there in order to get involved. You hear people talking about things like an IT or a virtual, I'm missing the term for a second, but for Africa, you might say
reality.
Solution. Yeah, moonshot, exactly. And so in all of that, what we're seeing is I would say a revolution in recognition about the need for flexibility, improvisation, and the importance of local solutions in battle with our traditional models that tend to be much more donor dominated and much more limited in terms of their ability to communicate and share. You might see it as a story of creative destruction, and as far as I'm concerned, it's the first big test of the planet's response to 21st century global challenges. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Larry, and thank you for the three panelists for keeping up the time. Before we come back to you, to the three panelists for a final question, I would like to give opportunity to some of the people to comment or ask questions. I see that already we have Eyal Biram from the Peoplehood Coalition who would like to make a comment. Eyal, please. Eyal, are you with us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, great. So first of all, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Eyal. I'm sorry I have a problem with my camera. We are part of organization Israel Is. Our daily mission is to train young Israelis traveling abroad, being ambassador of Israel. But today we created a coalition with Birthright, with Keren Hayesod, with Reut Institute, with the IDC. And I will share my screen. I will show you just by a second, if you can just give me permission to share my screen. We created COVID-19 solutions. It's a hub of Israelis solutions that we share with the world, and we're sharing solutions coming out of Israel. We have a community in Israel, from the US, even from Iraq. And the idea is to create together a coalition of communities that together can go over and get a better solution for the COVID-19. I'll just show you, for example, and I think it could be very interesting for each one of you. This is the platform. It's called COVID-19solutionsnow.org, and that's offer free information open for everyone all over the world. The idea is a combination between webinars and a community, and I will show you just one example, of course, and we have also a session tomorrow about the day after that includes some interesting information. One of them, I will just share one of the opportunities that we are sharing tomorrow is organization Light from Generation to Generation, and the idea is to create media rooms in the nerd houses. So this is just one of the solutions that we are sharing tomorrow to create better connection with elderly. And I'm just showing you one screen of the community. This is a picture that's sent from India, and the idea is to create a community that combines people from Israel and out of Israel that shares the solutions. And we understood that this is the power that we can create right now, because in the US, in Argentina, in more and more countries, there is still a major problem. So this is just one idea. I will share again the address that everyone can get inside.
19 crisis. We will start with you. Please 1 to 2 minutes for each one of the speakers. Eitan, please go ahead.
I'm confident that the NGOs and all those who are focused on the social benefit of their actions, if it's investment or if it's managing donations, they are necessary and they have to, and they will be easy to bounce back, as you mentioned, as you called it. I believe there's a lot of room for collaboration between the institutes in order to save costs and to be more efficient, and try to reach models of a blended finance, I call it, which creates a mixed revenue stream, not relying only on donations, but also on certain incomes in the business model.
Thank you, Eitan, and definitely diversifying the sources of income is one of the best models to develop organizational resilience.